So I should perhaps have introduced myself, and I apologise for not doing so. Stephen Bourne. I'm the Chief Executive of the Press and University Printer. And this is my humble abode. And it's a wonderful building. Great opportunity to have the Pitt building in which to host a lecture of this kind and to celebrate the birth of William Pitt, along with everything else that we are celebrating this year. And, of course, one of the big events of the year from our point of view at the Press, our very narrow and jaundiced point of view, of course, is that this is our 425th anniversary of printing our first publication. And we also celebrate the 500th anniversary of the accession of King Henry VIII to the throne. And he, if you like, was our founding father. It was he who signed the charter that enabled the press to happen in the first place. So that's our little bit of history. And now we turn to William Hague, our speaker for this evening. And we all know about William, don't we? Well, I thought maybe that there are a few things that you might not know about him, so I thought I would share a couple of those. First of all, that he was, and I don't even know if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, William, he was educated at Wath-on-Dearne Comprehensive School. Now, that's somewhere near Rotherham. All people from the Rotherham area, please stand up if they're directors of the press. Dr. Richard Zimaki, you have one there. So he was educated there before heading downhill to the other place, you know, where he became president of the Oxford Union and honed that debating style that we can witness nowadays. Did you know that he had an MBA also from INSEAD? No one answered yes to that. So revelations here. Did you know that he once worked for McKinsey? Yes, they all knew that. Okay. Did you know that he was a liveryman of the worshipful company of stationers and newspaper makers? Could we have all hands up of stationers in this room? So you're among friends, William. But he has been MP for Richmond, where another of our directors has retired, for the past 20 years. And during that time, he's somehow found the time to write just a little. And one of them, of course, is this wonderful book, which won the History Book of the Year award for 2005. It is, of course, about William Pitt the Younger. He's also written, and published in 2007, I think, a biography of William Wilberforce. And then along the way, as I say, he did a little bit in the way of politics and is now Shadow Foreign Secretary and has been so since December 2005. So that's what he does. If you don't like his policies and you fancy roughing him up a bit, my advice is don't. Because he's a member of the Budokwai Martial Arts Club. So I think the best thing that I could do is, rather than antagonize him further, get out of his way quickly. William Hague.
Well, Stephen, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for that introduction and for inviting me to talk to you tonight on the 250th anniversary of the birth of William Pitt. And it's very good of you, given the celebrations going on of 425 years of Cambridge University publishing, it's very good of you to adopt such a much more recent anniversary as one only in 1759. And it is the 250th anniversary today of his birth, and it's therefore the 207th anniversary of the great meeting in the Merchant Taylors' Hall, which came together on his birthday, the year after he had left office as Prime Minister. He left office in 1801 temporarily as Prime Minister, which was called together by his supporters, a great feast where they sang or recited certain passages in his honour. He wasn't present there himself. He disdained to attend himself, inviting him to return to office at some point in the future. And a couple of the verses went like this. One said, "And shall not his memory to Britain be dear, whose example with envy all nations behold, a statesman unbiased by interest or fear, by power uncorrupted, untainted by gold." which is exactly what people are looking for at the moment, of course. And it went on, it concluded after many other verses, and oh, if again the rude whirlwind shall rise, the dawning of peace should fresh darkness deform, the regrets of the good and the fears of the wise shall turn to the pilot that weathered the storm. And this was the legend of Pitt, the pilot that weathered the storm. That was how he was regarded by his supporters at the beginning of the 19th century, who idolized him. It can't be said that everybody in the country idolized him in the same way. Many, of course, held him in contempt, as they do any incumbent prime minister. He received hate mail. I printed in my book a piece of hate mail I really enjoyed from 1805 that said, "I say, Billy, you infernal blackguardly son of a thief, you bottle-nosed rascal of a prime minister. Egad, my old buck." Nobody puts egad in hate mail anymore. Right? They did 200 years ago. "Egad, my old buck, you'll be getting alongside of the devil soon, but he'll shave your timbers for you and give you a broadside and send you. But he won't send you to Windsor to drink 3 bottles of wine after dinner while many a poor thing can't get bread, and all through you, you meagre-looking hound." And so, well alive in 1805 was the marvellous British tradition of irreverence towards their political leaders that is fully on display in the 21st century. And we all have our little bits of post that's from more modern times that strike a nice parallel with that. I think one of my favourite bits of mail I've received as an MP said, from a constituent, said, "I hope you can take some constructive criticism of your recent speech. It was rubbish." That's what a Yorkshireman calls constructive criticism. And actually, my favourite letter, which arrived 2 years ago, said, "Dear Mr. Hague, the Taliban have taken over Anne Widdecombe's body and no one has noticed." And that was the end. There was no other explanation of the letter. It's all sincerely, end of letter. But that irreverence that is there now was there then. And it was not some genteel age where they all deferred to the politicians of the time. They were part of the rough and tumble of debate, and the press were perhaps even ruder. The cartoons of the time, more explicit and ruder than what we see today. Today we have to put up with, the front cover of Private Eye and things like that. I was once on the front cover of Private Eye with a picture of me and Cecil Parkinson, and there was a bubble coming out of my mouth that said, "I want to bring unity to the party." And there was a bubble coming out of Cecil's mouth that said, "Is she a goer?" which tells you something about the state of my party at the time. But there would be leaflets of that time which carried much sexual innuendo about Pitt and his lack of familiarity with women, that were very rude and sexually graphic about the royal family and their cartoons. They had plenty to go on, of course, because of Prince George, Prince of Wales, who had, even by the standards, more recent standards of the royal family, perhaps the most catastrophic marriage in the entire history of our royal family, sending his mistress to greet Caroline of Brunswick at the docks, asking for brandy as soon as he saw her, being drunk throughout the wedding. And of course, it culminated at his coronation after he was crowned, George IV having refused to let her into Westminster Abbey, where she was hammering on the doors outside during the coronation ceremony itself in 1821, when Napoleon died and the messages came to him to say that Your Majesty, your greatest enemy, is dead. He apparently replied, "By God, is she?" and thought they were talking about his wife. And the newspapers had a great deal to go at that time, but they certainly went at it. And so Pitt had to cope with all of that as a politician at the end of the 18th century, early 19th century. And he achieved much more, in my view, than he's generally been given credit for in popular memory. I've always believed, and this is why I've been so determined to come and give this talk tonight in the middle of an election campaign of the 21st century, I've always believed that his memory is not honoured enough. What most people know about him might have been summed up by that scene on Blackadder a few years ago, where someone is depicted talking to him and say, "Well, who are you then? Pitt the elder, Pitt the younger, Pitt the embryo, what are you?" And he is depicted answering questions as Prime Minister about his Latin vocabulary. And when I made a notorious speech when I was 16 years old, I was taken off to see Margaret Thatcher for the first time, who was leader of the opposition. This is in 1977. And, well, first of all, she said, "You must go and telephone your mother." And I can't tell you how irritating it is as a teenager to be told in public to go and telephone your mother. But I took that in my stride. And the next thing she said was, "We may be standing here with another young Mr. Pitt." And I, not having studied much history at school, thought, who on earth is she talking about? I hadn't really heard much of Mr. Pitt at all, but I thought afterwards I'd better take myself off and learn about Mr. Pitt. And by the time I became leader of the Conservative Party 20 years later, I'd learnt so much about Mr. Pitt that I put his portrait on the wall of the Shadow Cabinet room after the Conservative shattering election defeat of 1997, so that he might inspire us, so that his portrait on the wall might stir us to think that whatever difficulties we had, he encountered far greater difficulties in his life, and he was on the wall there throughout my 4 years as leader of the party. And then, this portrait having failed to provide the necessary inspiration to bring about a Conservative victory in 2001, I set about learning more about him and writing a book about him, and started out by visiting his grave in Westminster Abbey, a remarkable grave because that's the grave of him and his father, two prime ministers, buried in the same tomb in the north transept of Westminster Abbey. And it is just where the tourists all come in to see the Abbey. I can see them queuing there from my office, and I resent them because I know they are going to walk over his grave. And the inscription on his grave has been worn almost smooth by the passage of hundreds of thousands of feet. And I said to the authorities in the Abbey, perhaps I can use some of the proceeds of my book to restore the lettering on the grave, and let's have it chiseled back into what it should be. First of all, because they looked astonished at the idea that a Yorkshireman was going to spend money unnecessarily. But having recovered from that, they went off to look up what the inscription was and found out they didn't know what had been written on the grave. Maybe someone here may have a record of it, but I haven't yet found it, and so I haven't been able to engage in its restoration, if indeed that would be allowed. But the passage of all those feet shuffling over his grave and the lack of knowledge about what it might have said on it really reinforced for me that his memory was not honoured enough. Amplified further when I became a member of the London Pitt Club, one of the few surviving Pitt clubs that still honour his memory. And one of the members said to me as I sat down to my first dinner, "Listen here, young man, you know about this sort of stuff. Which Pitt is it we're on about at this club anyway?" And so even the members of the Pitt Club weren't very sure which Pitt they were honouring. And yet here was a man who was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the age of 23, who was Prime Minister at the age of 24, having twice refused to take office as Prime Minister before the age of 24, who was Prime Minister for 19 years in total, and who, even when he died in office as Prime Minister, after 19 years, was still younger than all but two of his 38 successors to date as Prime Minister, even when they entered office as Prime Minister. Here is a man who restored the finances of the nation and its navy and its fortunes and respect after the terrible defeats of the American War of Independence, who lived in 10 Downing Street longer than any other politician before or since, who was the longest-serving war leader of this country in modern times, who dealt with the insanity of George III and all the crises that it produced, who debated in the House of Commons in an age of eloquence with Fox and Sheridan and Burke and Wilberforce, and was the equal or master of them all, who dealt with the repeated threat of invasions of Britain, with an all-out mutiny in the Royal Navy at the height of a war, who dealt with a run on the Bank of England, not merely a run on a bank, which we've had in more modern times, but a run on the bank, the Bank of England itself, who suppressed rebellion in Ireland, who plotted naval strategy with Nelson, and who stood alone against Napoleon. And so this is a towering figure in our history, and we should be more conscious of his life and achievements that at some points in the last 250 years we have managed to be. He is a difficult man to get to know. He was difficult to get to know in life, and he's difficult to get to know in death, because he was a rather paradoxical character in so many different ways. He is regarded as the founder of the Tory party, because the people who he left behind him when he died, for want of any other better collective description, were initially known as Pitt's friends and then coalesced into the Tory party of the 19th century. But he would never have described himself as a Tory. He really believed that he should succeed on merit without any party label or consideration. Never courted a party following, and if anything, described himself as an independent Whig. He was a master of financial affairs, Chancellor of the Exchequer throughout the entire 19 years he was Prime Minister. Chancellor of the Exchequer as well, which at least avoided damaging splits between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, another lesson for modern times, and was regarded within weeks of coming to office as having, someone said, so remarkable a knowledge of the commerce and funds of the country that he might have been dealing with it for 50 years. And yet he was so incompetent and inattentive in his own personal finances that when he died, he left debts which in today's money would have been £2 million, which were written off by a grateful Parliament, something that certainly wouldn't happen today, and certainly is not happening today. He was also brilliant at the administration of government and at seeing at how it could be reformed, and yet again utterly incompetent in his own personal administration, neglecting letters for months and sometimes years. When he died in 1806, some letters were found in his desk unopened from the 1780s, which he had never got round to attending to from more than 20 years before. He was regarded by many of his contemporaries as the wittiest man they ever knew, those who really got close to him, and yet to others, as he confessed to William Wilberforce, I am the shyest man alive, he said. He seemed a cold, aloof, and difficult man to get to know. He was an eternal optimist, often inappropriately optimistic about military events and their likely consequences, and yet he also managed to work and worry and drink himself to death. And so he was a strange character, difficult to define. And of course the question that always occurs to people when you mention William Pitt the Younger is, how on earth could a 24-year-old become Prime Minister? In any age, how on earth did that happen? It never happened before. It has not happened since, not remotely. It is an absolutely safe bet that it will not happen again in the future of this country. So how on earth did this happen? And in answering that question, we will learn much more about him. Well, the first of 5 principal reasons why it was possible for a 24-year-old to become Prime Minister was that he was the son of his father. An obvious thing to say, but his father was like the Churchill of his day, a controversial, voluble, but brilliant politician, the man who had been called into office in what they called then the Great War, having no knowledge of the wars that were to come, the 7 Years' War. And it was he who turned around the fortunes of the nation politically and militarily. And in 1759, the year that Pitt was born, the elder Pitt's strategy was paying off. The news of the victories from all over the world was pouring in. Victories across India, with the Empire of Britain being much extended. Victory on the high seas in the West Indies. Victory at Minden on the continent. Victory, of course, in the autumn of that year at Quebec, with the French cleared from Canada and France's empire being taken to pieces. And Horace Walpole wrote, "Our church bells are worn threadbare with their ringing." It was the great year of victories. And so the elder Pitt, although he left office a couple of years later with the war still continuing, was revered as a great leader of the country. And the younger Pitt, in his infancy, in his earliest years, would have been conscious he was the son of a very great man. The earliest descriptions of the family going on holiday include them hearing the church bells of Yeovil being rung in their honour as they passed by the town on their way to Weymouth, of flowers being strewn before them, of a deputation of Mohicans being diverted from their visit in order to bow before the great elder Pitt. He would know he was the son of a very great man. And he would know, too, when his father returned to office briefly as Prime Minister in 1766 and declined into hypochondria and probably manic depression, that it turned out that his mother was no mean leader and administrator either, since she managed to conduct successfully the dealings with the rest of the cabinet and the king on his father's behalf. And so the younger Pitt, by the age of 9, would have realized from knowing his mother and his father that there really was no limit to what he could achieve, and nothing particularly unthinkable about leading the country and being able to do so. And so by the age of 7, he wanted to serve, he said, in the House of Commons like Papa, something that to me even sounds ridiculously precocious at the age of 7. But that was the younger Pitt, who did not go to school. His father thought he was too delicate a boy to send him to anywhere such as Eton. He was educated at home until the age of 14, when he came across the street here to Pembroke as a prodigy to be admired, as his tutor explained it, and where he devoted himself to classics and mathematics. It was as extraordinary then as it would be now for a 14-year-old to arrive here at the university. My examination of the admissions book of that time across the road revealed that only a minority of the students of that time were under 18, let alone 14 when they arrived. But while being educated at home, he was actually attending a master class in oratory and politics at the feet of his father, who would make him stand before him every evening to translate contemporaneously into Latin and Greek, not allowing him to proceed until he had found the perfect word. And so he developed the ability to speak on his feet. And it meant that when he arrived in the House of Commons at the age of 21, people were astonished by what Wraxall, the great observer of parliamentary events, said was his transcendent eloquence. Every word, another observer said, seemed to be the one that even the most diligent study would have selected. And Edmund Burke was heard to exclaim after his maiden speech, "This is not a chip off the old block, this is the block itself." And so being his father's son was one of the crucial factors that allowed him to be so young a prime minister. The second was, and this can be a convenient thing for young politicians, that events wiped out most of the older politicians. The loss of the American War disgraced the people who had led the country during the war, such as Lord North, while those who had opposed the war were in disgrace with King George III for opposing it. And it had been a humiliating national experience. The French and Spanish navies cruising unmolested in the English Channel in 1779, their rubbish being washed ashores on the southern beaches of England with the Royal Navy impotent to clear them from the sea. And after that experience, there was a search for new leadership that led to political convulsions in the early 1780s. And George III was determined to find a prime minister not contaminated by what had happened before. At one point, offering office to Pitt's distant uncle, Mr. Thomas Pitt, and then calling for Mr. Thomas Pitt or Mr. Thomas anybody, rather than have Charles James Fox admitted to high office. And this allowed Pitt, the younger Pitt, to step into the breach at an early age. The third factor that allowed him to do this was that youthfulness was much more indulged in politics then than it is today. We think we live in an age of youth in the 21st century, but not compared to the late 18th century. There were only 3 members of Parliament under the age of 30 elected to the current House of Commons when it was elected at the last general election in 2005. But in the House of Commons elected in 1780, of which Pitt became a member, 100 members were under the age of 30, in a house that was not much smaller than today. Politics was much more frequently a young man's game. And of course, they were used to the idea that the rulers of nations could be very young, since many of them were the monarchs of other countries. Louis XVI had ascended the throne of France at the age of 20. Frederick the Great had embarked on his great career at the age of 28. Gustavus III of Sweden was 25 when he became the king. And this extended to other fields of life. I have at home now the portrait of Pitt by the great portrait artist Thomas Lawrence. Pitt was 21 when it was drawn. Lawrence was 13. It was one prodigy sketching another. And we are in the period where Alexander Pope had published his first works at the age of 12, and Isaac Newton was renowned for his work at the age of 25, and Adam Smith was a professor of logic at the age of 28. And so the idea that people could enjoy great responsibilities or dispense considerable wisdom in their 20s was far more prevalent then than it is today. The fourth factor that allowed him to succeed to becoming Prime Minister was the patronage that allowed young men to come into politics so readily and at such a youthful age. He was able to write excitedly to his mother, Appleby is the seat I am to represent. He said, I am to be elected without having any trouble at all and without even having to visit my constituents, which indeed he didn't. He never visited Appleby. When I gave a talk about Pitt in Appleby, people came up to me to say that Pitt had once stood there and had once stood over there by the Market Cross, and I had to disappoint them and say, he never came within 150 miles of Appleby, because I know what he did, or can find out what he did almost every day of his life. And he never came there. He represented a rotten borough. He was appointed to it by the northern boroughmonger Sir James Lowther in 1781, having been defeated in the election for Cambridge University. But 3 years later, as Prime Minister, he contested Cambridge again, a much more democratic constituency where the members of the University Senate, several hundred of them at that time, were able to cast their votes, and he was elected and remained the member for Cambridge University, something of which he was immensely proud to the day he died. But it's important to remember when we discuss 18th century politics what an extraordinary mixture of skullduggery and bribery and democracy made up the elections of those times. They involved vast amounts of alcohol sometimes. The Grosvenor family in the city of contesting the city of Chester in 1784, when Pitt was confirmed in office as Prime Minister, provided for the voters 1,187 barrels of ale, 3,756 gallons of rum and brandy, and 27,000 bottles of wine for an election that involved 1,500 voters. Now, those were the days when elections were much more enjoyable than they are today. In the county of Yorkshire in 1807, when, the year after Pitt's death, when William Wilberforce was challenged in a full-scale county election, in the general election of that year, with one polling station in the middle of the whole of Yorkshire, which the voters had to be transported to, the costs of the candidates came to three candidates, came to £250,000 in 1807 money, the equivalent of £15 million today, which would be the cost now of the entire national general election campaign of one of the main political parties. That was what was spent in the one constituency in an election in 1807. And these elections sometimes were riotous. The city of Westminster held its poll open for 40 days in the election of 1784, waiting for more people to vote. 40 days riot and 40 days confusion, as Pitt described it. In that election, we were talking about the stationers' company. He was given the freedom of the city of London in the Grocers' Hall in his first few weeks as Prime Minister. And on the 28th of February 1784, was taken from his brother's house in Berkeley Square in London to the Grocers' Hall. And after the great feast and ceremony there, he was going back to Berkeley Square when the crowd, and this was a great honour at that time, insisted on taking the horses off the carriage and pulling him along themselves, which was a great honour, except the crowd were then in charge of where you were going. And they they changed the route somewhat. And when they got along Pall Mall, they hissed long and loud outside the Prince of Wales house, Carlton House, to Pitt's acute embarrassment. They then tried to turn down, when they turned the corner into St James's Street, into Little St James's Street, to break the windows of Charles James Fox, which they were at length dissuaded from doing. And when they got higher up St James's Street, the members of Brooks's club came out with poles and broken chairs and bits of furniture and set about Pitt's carriage. Brooks, being a very Whiggish club, beat it almost to destruction. Pitt had to be dragged to the safety of White's. It tells you something about politics in those days, that the alibi with which Charles James Fox showed he could not have been present at this affray was that he was in bed with his mistress at the time. And everybody thought that was a perfectly adequate explanation. The fifth, I'm digressing a little bit from how he became, but I do enjoy the politics of that time. The fifth reason he was able to become Prime Minister at 24, on top of all these factors of youth and events and the patronage, was that he did also happen to be brilliant at politics. And he was brilliant at creating an image of himself. One of the first politicians, really, to consciously create an image of himself in the burgeoning press of the time, which had only really started reporting parliamentary proceedings because it hadn't been allowed to do so until recently before then. It only just started reporting parliamentary proceedings in great detail. And he created an image of himself that was appealing to the country at a time of thieving, venal politicians. People sometimes say to me, at the moment, has the reputation of MPs ever been lower? And I think, well, possibly. You have to go back to the 1770s and 1780s, but not far off what we see today. And they, of course, had abuse of office, which makes any of today's abusers look decidedly amateurish. There was Henry Fox, Charles James Fox's father, being Paymaster General, making millions in today's money in a short spell as Paymaster General, since the habit was to take commissions on foreign loans and to pay the government's pay bill into your own bank account and disperse it as you saw fit, often with some left over, taking the interest as well at the time. There were very different standards then. And along came Pitt, who in one of his first acts as the new young Prime Minister appointed by the King against the opposition of the House of Commons, was to disdain one of the sinecures that came available because its occupant had died, and it would have been entirely in conformity with the political habits of the time for him to appoint himself to this meaningless office which carried an income of £5,000 a year. He declined to do so. He saved the taxpayer the money, and the legend of Honest Billy was born. And in an age where people were utterly disillusioned with their politicians, Honest Billy had real popular appeal. And he also came as a new young politician with the modern ideas of that time, favouring free trade, favouring the abolition of the slave trade on good economic, not just on libertarian grounds, favouring the reform of the House of Commons, something that he did not actually manage to achieve, favouring making government more efficient and tidying up all the many different accounts of the Treasury and the complex ways in which government departments went ineffectively about their business. And so he was the modern, appealing politician of the time, at least to begin with. And he brought remarkable talents. Among them, that transcendent eloquence that I referred to a moment ago. His speeches in the House of Commons were reliably brilliant, even when he was the young Chancellor of the Exchequer, when he was so sick listening to Charles James Fox denouncing that he was actually vomiting through the door of the House of Commons while listening to the speech to which he had to reply. He returned to the dispatch box and gave a long and brilliant response. He composed budgets. He delivered 25 budgets at least, more than anyone else in the last 200 years. But there are accounts of him composing himself for a budget by having his sister and other guests to lunch at Downing Street, by saying he needed to go off and clear his mind about something, walking in St James's Park for 20 minutes, and then going down to the House of Commons with only notes in front of him and delivering a budget speech of 4 or 5 hours in length without making a single error. His speech on the abolition of the slave trade in 1792, again something not quite achieved in his lifetime, was regarded by contemporaries as one of the great feats of oratory, speaking at 5 a.m. on an April morning. And as the first shafts of the sunlight came through the windows of the House of Commons, talking of the new dawn in Africa, brilliantly choreographing his speech and the rising of the sun. His speech on the resumption of war with France in 1803, this is in a brief period when he wasn't Prime Minister, was that although it was not recorded in any detail, because the arrangements for admission to the public gallery had been changed that day and all the reporters were locked out of the gallery, those MPs who wrote about it capture the atmosphere of a Pitt speech in
Parliament. One of them said it was the greatest of his harangues, Bonaparte absorbing the whole power of France, Egypt consecrated by the heroic blood that had been shed upon it, the liquid fire of Jacobinical principles desolating the world, an electrifying peroration on the necessity and magnitude of our future exertions. And one of the hostile MPs wrote, "Then came the great fiend himself, Pitt, who in the elevation of his tone of mind and composition, in the infinite energy of his style, the miraculous perspicuity and fluency of his periods, outdid, as it was thought, all former performances of his. Never was there such an exhibition. Its effect was dreadful." And so here was a real orator, added to which was real intellect. He sought in office neat, lasting solutions to complex, seemingly intractable problems. Faced with the smuggling of tea, in which tens of thousands of people were employed in the early 1780s, he vastly reduced the complexity of tea duties, cutting them down from more than 100 different rates of duty to just a simple rate of duty that put the smugglers out of business. He then had to work with the tea merchants to stop the attempted cornering of the tea market in retaliation for his measures. He ended up with a simpler and lower rate tax that actually yielded more revenue, another lesson for policymakers in our own time. Dealing with the run on the Bank of England in 1797, he found the solution, working to rebuild confidence in the financial market, of creating paper money on a far greater scale. Hence it was written, if I can remember the words, "Of Augustus and Rome the poets still warble, how he found it of brick and left it of marble. So of Pitt and of England men may say without vapour, that he found it of gold and left it of paper." Not necessarily one of his greatest achievements, but a necessary one. He sought to resolve the intractable problems of Ireland by a full union between Ireland and Great Britain, creating the Union Parliament, with Ireland having full representation in the House of Commons. Not something that worked in the end, but the radical and principled solution to it. He was a talented spotter of talent, and all of the prime ministers and most of the leading ministers who led the country for 21 years after his death had served in his administrations. He was perhaps the first real modern prime minister, using the power of the Treasury to establish centralized control of the other government departments, something that previous leaders such as Lord North had disdained to do. And he was a brilliant parliamentary tactician, seen at its most advantageous in the Regency crisis of 1789, spinning out parliamentary debate for fully 3 months, while the king was raving, was shaking hands with a tree, believing it to be the king of Prussia, was flinging himself against walls and having to be put into straitjackets. It was Pitt who insisted that the king might recover, and a regency did not need to be declared, coming up with precedents from more than 300 years earlier that needed committees to examine them in great detail, that went on for weeks, bringing new doctors to try to get a different diagnosis, and the king recovering 5 days before a regency was due to be declared. And instead of the king coming into his senses to find his enemies in power, Pitt was still there, hailed by the king and the nation for standing by the monarch. He was disinterested in money, as I have earlier described, that led to his great debts, money or titles, but he knew others were susceptible to money and titles. And so while incorruptible himself, he knew well how to manage the political system. And when he needed the Irish House of Commons to vote itself out of existence in 1800, observers may have noticed that 28 of its members subsequently succeeded to new peerages of one sort or another, and others were credited with 4,000 guineas for their vote. They duly voted themselves out of existence. Incorruptible himself, he knew how to get others to vote the right way. So he was a real political operator. What were his weaknesses amidst all of this? Well, he was an aloof figure. There are accounts of him walking into the House of Commons, refusing to look left or right or greet other members of Parliament, who would have given half their fortune to have had a discussion with him for half an hour. And he became frozen as a personality in many ways at the age of 24 when he became Prime Minister. It is a distinctive feature of holding high political office in government, in my view, that you cease to develop as a person, although you may learn quite a lot as a politician or minister. At that point, you make very few new friends because you don't know who you can trust, and you don't develop new interests because you don't have time. And for those of us who cycle in and out of senior political office, this still allows us to become vaguely resembling human beings in the years where we're not in government. But for someone who becomes Prime Minister at the age of 24 and remains Prime Minister for 19 of the subsequent 22 years before their death, his remarkable growth and achievements as a politician stunted his growth as a man. And it meant, for example, that he was not able to travel. Far from going to Appleby in Westmoreland, he actually never, as far as we can tell, made it north of Northampton in his life, or west of Weymouth. He managed an empire and conducted great wars without ever having seen a mountain, without ever having seen the Lake District, without ever having been to Wales, only having been to France once in his life because he was not able to travel abroad due to warfare for much of his life. He developed little interest in women, or indeed, as far as we can tell, in any sexual relations. Much fun was made of this from time to time. He relied too much on the habits he had developed as a teenager at Cambridge of enjoying conversation about politics, classics, and mathematics, and a good deal of port, washing down his meals. He sometimes was drunk in the House of Commons. Shortly after the declaration of war in 1793, when he walked into the House of Commons with his great friend and fixer, Dundas, the opposition newspaper made fun of them by saying, "I cannot see the Speaker, Hal, can you? What cannot see the Speaker, I see too." And much fun was made of his drinking. One of the most enjoyable aspects of doing the research on my book was to spend an afternoon with Berry Brothers and Rudd working out just how much he must have drunk by drinking 3 bottles of port a day. He was known as a 3-bottle man. It turns out that the glass was much thicker than it is today. The punt at the base of the bottle was much bigger, and so the bottles only held about 2/3 as much liquid as they would today and were not as fortified with brandy. So it was like drinking 2 bottles of strong wine a day. No longer an unimaginable amount, as 3 bottles of port may be, but still quite a lot to drink if you are the Prime Minister and war leader at the same time. These were his weaknesses, among his weaknesses and defects. Nevertheless, he was clearly a brilliant politician and leader with great ideas when he took office, intending to repay the national debt within 28 years through a sinking fund. That was one of the goals of his life. Where did all this go wrong? Well, it went wrong because of the French Revolution, the importance of which we cannot really overstate in the history and politics of that time. An earthquake in the political world, in Britain as well as, of course, in France, because that was an event that was to change British politics, that split the Whig Party asunder, split Fox from Burke, that confirmed Pitt in office with a vast conservative-inclined majority, but led him to very different domestic policies and all the demands of warfare. The man who had been noted for favouring parliamentary reform and the abolition of the slave trade, what we would think of now as progressive causes, became known in the 1790s for Pitt's terror, for repression, for the suspension of habeas corpus, for show trials, and so on. The man who was brilliant with finance placed too much faith in France being defeated because it would run out of money. But this was not a war in which France needed money, because it was fueled by revolution and by vast numbers of people, by a political revolutionary force that was new to the politicians of that time and which Pitt was slow to understand. The French Convention declaring on August 1793, "From this moment until that in which our enemies shall have been driven from the territory of the Republic, All Frenchmen are requisitioned for service in the armies. The young men shall fight, the married men shall forge weapons and transport supplies, the women will make tents and clothes and will serve in the hospitals, the children will make up old linen into lint, the old men will have themselves carried into public squares to rouse the courage of fighting men, to preach the unity of the republic and the hatred of kings. This was the vast mobilization of the most populous nation of Europe to wage total war, something that he, certainly, Pitt, was not ready for, and Britain was not ready for. Both sides thought it would be a short war, but Britain had reserves of finance and France of manpower that meant a quarter of a century of war would now take place. Pitt would not live to see the end of it. He distrusted himself on military subjects with good reason, since he had no experience in the field, of course, of military matters, and his interference with the work of generals was sometimes disastrous. But he seemed to have a good instinct for naval decisions, and his decision to send part of the navy back into the Mediterranean to search for the French Mediterranean fleet in 1798, even when England was in danger of invasion, can be compared to Churchill's decision to send tanks to the North African desert in 1940 when Britain was in danger of invasion. And it led to a similarly dramatic result, the annihilation of the French Mediterranean fleet at the Battle of the Nile in 1798. His work when he returned to office in 1804 to make sure the Navy was at its most powerful possible paid dividends too, of course, in 1805, as I shall mention in a moment. But it was returning to office in 1804 with his reserves of health and of political support really near their end that was to kill him. He seemed to know that it may do so. He actually said that he would prefer to die at his post rather than desert it, illustrating a devotion to public life, an inability to think of life other than in public office, which is rare indeed, even among the most famous political leaders of our history. The pressures of life as a war leader prime minister were undoubtedly enormous. Even in the days before 24-hour news, media, there were a mass of decisions to be made for a man who took the vast majority of decisions upon himself. I recount in my book just one day, the 25th of May, 1797, to show what a day might be like for a prime minister like that, being woken early to the sound of artillery fire because the soldiers were rioting across the river at Woolwich. Then going down into a cabinet meeting where the news came through that Austria, Britain's last remaining ally in the war against France, was considering pulling out of the war. Then hearing that there was to be an opposition motion condemning him for every kind of other misfortune in the House of Commons that afternoon, and spending the whole evening long into the night debating into the Commons while still trying to manage the war effort. The physical toll was enormous. And the doctors who I asked, the modern doctors who I asked to analyze the 11 years of records of his physical symptoms, discounted the previously entertained theories that he might have died of cancer or cirrhosis of the liver, because his symptoms came and went. And they concluded that it was ulcers in his stomach that made him ill and that were eventually to kill him. If an ulcer in those days blocked your digestive system, there wasn't anything that could be done for you. There were no antibiotics at the time. And it was consistent with that condition that he drew some sustenance from alcohol, that he was occasionally able to eat, but at other times unable to keep anything down. And by late 1805, once again, taking on his own shoulders an immense war effort, he was clearly very worn down. And the events of the first week of November 1805 illustrate what life was like for him. On the Sunday, November the 3rd, a Dutch newspaper arrived in London with a report that Napoleon had destroyed an entire Austrian army at Ulm. And they had to take around London. Pitt had to get it taken around London to find someone who can translate it from the Dutch. But when the story was confirmed to him, one observer said he gave a look that was not his own, that foretold the loss with which we were threatened. Each new defeat was striking a wound inside him. Eventually, he was killed by in the words of the Duke of Wellington, it was news from the front that struck a terrible blow within. And yet, 4 days later, on November the 7th, news arrived of the Battle of Cape Trafalgar. The battle had been fought on October 21st. One of the fascinating things for us, I think, about those times is that since news could still travel no faster than a horse or a ship, even a battle fought off the coast of Spain took 18 days for the news of it to arrive in London, with the messages arriving on the south coast late at night on the 6th of August, the messages galloping through the night to London to wake the Prime Minister at 3 a.m., with the news in the dispatch of Admiral Collingwood of 20 sail of the line captured, the greatest and most decisive victory ever gained over a powerful enemy. But the news that Nelson, who had called on Pitt before he set off for that campaign, had been killed. And 2 days later, Pitt was again hauled along to the Guildhall for the annual speech of the First Lord of the Treasury, and toasted as the saviour of England. And he returned thanks with the simplest and one of the most memorable speeches by a Prime Minister in the whole of British history. He said, "England is not to be saved by any single man. England has saved herself by her exertions, and will, as I trust, save Europe by her example." And it was the last time his voice was ever heard in public. He was taken much more ill than he had previously been in the days that followed, went to Bath, as he often did, to try to recover his health in the spa water, but failed to do so this time. And it was while he was there that news of the shattering defeat for his allies of the Battle of Austerlitz came through. And he was alone. Britain would be alone once again, facing Napoleon at the height of his power, with Pitt having to account to the House of Commons for the destruction of the coalition against Napoleon, with a small majority and highly partisan politics being pursued at the height of a war in which Britain faced, of course, immense challenges and had only recently faced invasion. He had literally nothing left to look forward to. And taken back to his house in early January 1806 in Putney, it became clear to his closest friends that he was dying. Asked by his old tutor from Cambridge, who had become Bishop Prettyman, to pray, he said that he had neglected prayer for so long that he had no hope that it would be efficacious now. And so he did not embark on praying. He gradually drifted into a delirium on the night of the 22nd of January, 1806, sometimes saying, "Hear, hear," as if he was sitting in the House of Commons. Sometimes inquiring about the direction of the wind and saying, "East, that will bring him quick," hoping for a messenger to say from Berlin that Prussia would enter the war against Napoleon. His last words were variously reported as, "My country, how I love my country," or "My country, how I leave my country," or "Bring me one of Mrs. Bellamy's pork pies." Given the state of his digestion at the time, it seems highly unlikely that he called for a pork pie. It would have been much more in character, given his devotion to public office and to leading his country almost throughout his entire adult life, that he would say, "How I leave my country," because the state of the country was certainly not one that he could be satisfied with. And so this man, who had given his life entirely to public service and been the youngest Prime Minister by far in the history of the country, died at the age of 46. But his devotion to politics, to leadership, to government is remarkable by comparison even with the other great Prime Ministers and leaders who we can recall over the last 250 years. And it is remarkable that, as I concluded at the end of my book, that he so aligned his life with the fate of his country that at no moment of his existence was he able to separate himself from it. And that was William Pitt the Younger, born 250 years ago today. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Right, we have 10 minutes for some questions, or if there are any, you don't have to ask them, but you're very welcome to. Who would like to ask the first question? I think we have a roving microphone as well. Yes, there's one there, and then the gentleman here next. Yes.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I was struck by the image of the picture of Mr. Pitt looming over the shadow cabinet during your 4 years. Does that picture still hang in the shadow cabinet room? And is the shadow cabinet still looking to Mr. Pitt for inspiration?
It doesn't hang in the shadow cabinet room. I don't know what my successors did with it. I'm sure it's being well looked after somewhere. In fact, your question may prompt me to ask the House of Commons Authority where it is. So it's not there anymore. Does the current shadow cabinet look for it? No, well, thankfully circumstances have improved sufficiently that we no longer look to paintings for our inspiration. We're in slightly better shape than that. Next question, yes, there was a gentleman here. Yes.
In the letters that had lain neglected for 20 years, was there anything of significance in there that might have changed things substantially if he'd bothered to open them?
No, I don't think that was the way to avoid stomach ulcers or anything like that. That would have changed things dramatically. We don't know really what was in those letters. There are accounts of letters being unopened. I don't know which letters they were. And unfortunately, some of his close friends did destroy a lot of his papers on his death. Whether they did so deliberately to conceal something, we don't know. Thankfully, many papers survived. Quite a lot of them are in the university library here. And others are scattered all over the place in American universities and in the Public Record Office and so on. But no, we don't really know what was in those letters. He was not very good at attending to letters seeking honours of various kinds. He never really, he didn't, as you can tell, he didn't want any honours for himself. He knew that his father had gone wrong when he accepted a title. What Thomas Gray, and we may be going over to Gray's room, some of us later on over in Pembroke, when Pitt's father became the Earl of Chatham, Gray wrote, "Never was so weak a thing done by so great a man." And Pitt clearly never wanted to serve in the House of Lords. He was a House of Commons man. And disdained, really, people who sought titles, although he knew he could use them, as I mentioned earlier, because they sought titles. But he was inundated with letters from people saying that they should be appointed not only to earldoms, but to positions in the church, which the Prime Minister of that day controlled to a degree we would consider remarkable now. And really inundated with them. And many of the letters that he most seriously neglected were these letters, people putting themselves forward and there was one amusing, I can't remember it verbatim, but there's an amusing exchange of letters that I put in my book, where someone writes to say they've heard a rumour that they are to be Bishop of Norwich. Is he aware of this rumour? And he has to write a one-sentence reply saying he had heard no such thing and doesn't expect to, which got rid of that rumour very quickly. So it was those sorts of letters that he just had never bothered with and was never going to bother with. Next question. Are you all ready for a drink? Yes, sir, over there. And then there's one in the second row, I think.
Did the remarkable genes that produced the two Pitts subsequently produce any other remarkable people of that lineage?
No. Well, first of all, Pitt didn't pass on himself any of the genes. Again, this is disappointing to some people. I have been asked at meetings about, when I've talked about William Pitt, whether the person in the audience could possibly be a descendant. And I have to say, no, he had no children. So you're definitely not a descendant. What is more, his brother, who inherited the earldom, also had no children. So the male line died out. His sisters did live to have children. And of course, then you get into his celebrated niece, Lady Hester Stanhope, and so on. But it's not, I can't think of anyone among their heirs and successors who has featured prominently in the political world. So no, this was the end of the line, really. And his brother, while he served in Pitt's cabinet and was active in the House of Lords, was known as the late Lord Chatham because of his record of being unable to turn up to anything on time. And Pitt had him responsible for various military matters for the Admiralty, but he had to get rid of him, his own brother, when the war started, because he clearly was not up to handling such a serious situation. This political ability really just appeared in those two individuals and some of their predecessors. So you can go back, but not forward, to find political talent. Yes, there was a gentleman with a question here.
Yes, thank you. What do you think what is our inheritance? Tell me how politics or the country is different now compared to how it might have been if we hadn't had William Pitt. What are we left with now in 250 years later?
Well, first of all, I don't think it makes any difference to the importance of history if it is different now as a result of I think these events have a fascination. To me, they do, anyway, all of their own. But what was different, I think, first of all, was the way government functioned and was constructed. Because he was a centralizing force, as I mentioned briefly before, in the way British government worked. Lord North, if you had accused him of being Prime Minister, at times would have denied that he was the Prime Minister. Denied that he was a Tory or a Prime Minister when he was Tory Prime Minister. Because he didn't want to take responsibility for what was happening across the whole of government. Pitt, within a few years later, after Lord North, was very happy to take that responsibility and to dominate his cabinet colleagues and to ensure that the Treasury got its tentacles into everything. Maybe Gordon Brown took some lessons from him. He did a lot to create modern cabinet government as we understand it. I think his other biggest contribution, well, there are others that we may choose to forget. In his financial brilliance, he was the first one to introduce income tax in 1798 as a temporary measure. Revealingly, when he added up the whole income of the country and said it was £100 million, and that therefore a 10% tax rate would produce £10 million of revenue, when it came to the next year, when everybody had to declare their income, the income of the country had gone down to £50 million, and the revenue was only half what he was expecting. So then he had to start making sure people really were declaring the income they were receiving. But he brought innovations such as that into our financial system that then proved not to be very temporary. Repealed a few years later, but then brought back again, and simplified the system of taxation and really expanded, because of warfare, the role of the state in personal finances, something that had been very much resisted before. And I think his other contribution was in military matters. If he had lived to the end of the Napoleonic Wars, I think he would be automatically ranked up there with our great war leaders. But dying in the middle of a war is never very convenient for being remembered for the victory that was won at the end. If Churchill or Lloyd George had died in the middle of the world wars, we probably wouldn't revere them in the same way. But his attention to the Navy after the American War of Independence, and while allowing the country to have a very small army, but his rigorous attention to the Navy, following in a way his father's belief in a blue water strategy for this country and the importance of being able to win conflicts globally rather than compete with the great massed armies on the continent, was a very important insight that contributed, along with many other things such as Nelson's brilliance, to the naval victories in those wars that actually prevented the country from being invaded. And we could go on for a long time about how things might have been different had Napoleon been able to cross the Channel. So in these and many other ways, I think he did change our history. But whether he did or not, I just find it a fascinating tale. Any other questions? We've probably got time just for another. Yes, also in the second row here.
You several times mentioned close friends. What was the nature of those friendships?
They were, well, they were playful friendships. The accounts of him going to Wilberforce's villa in Wimbledon when they were both in their early 20s are of playing around in the garden, of him going out on his horse at night from the House of Commons when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and sending word ahead that he wanted a good meal of strawberries and peas from the garden. Then there are accounts of them cutting up each other's hats in the garden and leaving them in the flower beds. There was a lot of foining. Foining in its, not so much in its fencing sense, but of playing, of mucking around. And he always enjoyed, I think, a bit of physical rough and tumble in a way. There is even an account in his a few years before he died, of him playing around with his nieces and their friends, and his face being blackened by them, them having a good physical tussle. And when news arrived that Castlereagh was just outside the door with an important dispatch, and then the rest of the family hugely enjoyed the scene as he cleaned himself up, straightened himself up, and Castlereagh came in and bowed to the Prime Minister, and you would never have thought that this was the man who was playing around on the carpet 10 minutes before. So he enjoyed that sort of thing. He certainly had some very close friendships with a tight circle of friends. One of his great Cambridge friends was Edward Eliot, who then died suddenly at the age of 37. And the descriptions of Pitt when the news arrives in Downing Street unexpectedly of Eliot's death are of a man utterly distraught, and really in a state that they had never seen him before. So I think he had some deep affection for his friends. There's no evidence that was ever translated into sexual relationships. People have wondered whether he was gay. There was, as I mentioned, a lot of innuendo about his remoteness from women. But there's no evidence of that. And actually, I've come to the conclusion that somebody who was in that office from his early 20s and living in Downing Street all that time, and who clearly, from the accounts of them waking him up in the middle of the night, always slept with his door open and was disturbed by messengers, servants, and ministers 24 hours of the day, I think really he became or was asexual, that he lived an almost wholly political life. So he had close friends who he was deeply fond of, but they were a tight circle, and I don't think there was anything more to it than that. And I think the signal has come for...
Do we have one last question? We do.
Yes.
Professor Cox.
May I ask, what did he do as an MP for Cambridge?
He regularly came to dinner at Pembroke, which is a delight I am hoping to be about to enjoy. That's a very 21st century question, if I might say so, which is what we are asked now. What have you done for your constituency? There wasn't much of a concept in those days of having to do anything for your constituency, other than to go down to the House of Commons and use your judgment, or in his case, to go and run the country. So he was a regular correspondent with people in the university, and there are little bits of records of him intervening now and again to secure the smooth running of this and that. But it wasn't that sort of activist representation that we expect today. Those were the days.
So they were. Well, William, thank you very much indeed. This afternoon I was asked by someone whether this was to be a serious academic lecture or an entertainment, and I replied rather pompously, perhaps, well, of course it was going to be a serious academic lecture. And so it was, and extraordinarily well researched and beautifully delivered, if I may say so. But it was also a terrific entertainment, and we thank you for that. And I think it's a measure of how much people have enjoyed it, that no one is yet rushing across the road for that drink. But we shall do now. Once again, William Hague, many thanks.